The year was 1872, and the Arizona Territory was a land caught between two worlds. The sun burned the red earth during the day, and the cold winds of the desert swept across the plains at night. Soldiers lived in scattered forts far from home, surrounded by silence, dust, and the fear of the unknown. Among them was Daniel Hayes, a young cavalryman barely 24 years old. He was known for being quiet, respectful, and brave, though some said he thought too much for a soldier. Daniel had joined the army to escape the emptiness of the farm he had grown up on. The open land and the promise of duty seemed to give his life meaning, until the day he was told to do something he could not. The order had come at dawn. Daniel's company was to ride out and strike an Apache camp that had been seen in the mountains 2 days earlier. Rumors said the Apaches had stolen horses and attacked travelers, but the scouts also said the camp was full of women and children, with only a few men left. Daniel had seen enough of the frontier to know what those orders meant. He had seen what happened when fear ruled hearts, how the line between punishment and cruelty vanished in the dust. When his commanding officer, Captain Willis, gave the signal to mount up, Daniel didn't move. He stood still beside his horse, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "Sir," he said quietly, "that camp isn't a threat. They've got no warriors left. We shouldn't do this." Every man nearby froze. "You didn't question a captain's order, not in front of the others." The air turned heavy, filled with disbelief. Captain Willis turned sharply, his face turning red under the morning sun. "Hayes," he barked, "I didn't ask for your opinion." Daniel swallowed hard. "With respect, sir, we're soldiers, not executioners." That one sentence was enough. The captain's pride had been challenged, and the other men could feel the storm building. In the military, refusing an order was close to treason, especially on the frontier where authority was often the only law. By noon, Daniel was under arrest. They took his rifle, his revolver, and his badge of rank. For days he waited in the hot, cramped room of the fort's supply shed, guarded by two nervous recruits who didn't know whether to pity him or fear him. He had no regrets, but he did wonder what would happen next. He had never meant to shame his captain, only to stop something that felt wrong. But on the frontier, justice was often shaped by anger and pride, not fairness. When the trial came, it wasn't much of a trial at all. The captain's word was law, and Daniel's protest was seen as defiance. There were no witnesses called, no real defense. Within an hour, the verdict was decided. He was to be stripped of rank and duties, and his punishment would be decided by the commanding officers of the fort. Some expected a flogging, others whispered about prison labor. But what they decided instead shocked everyone. There was a woman at the fort, a young Apache woman captured months earlier during a raid. She had been traded between settlers and traders, until finally being sold to the fort's blacksmith for $5. She worked silently, cleaning floors and washing clothes. No one spoke to her except to give orders. The officers decided that Daniel's punishment would be to marry her. It was not an act of kindness. They wanted to humiliate him, to tie him to someone they saw as beneath him, someone the settlers treated as less than human. It was meant to break his pride and mark him forever. When Daniel heard the order, he thought it was a cruel joke. But the next day, he was led into the small chapel at the edge of the post. The chaplain, who looked uncomfortable, stood with a Bible in his hand. A few soldiers gathered outside to watch, whispering and laughing quietly. Then she was brought in. She was small, slender, and quiet. Her hands were bound with a thin rope. Her black hair was long and tangled, her eyes dark and unreadable. No one spoke her name aloud, but Daniel later learned she was called Tazi. She did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. She stood still, her expression blank, as the chaplain read the words of a marriage she did not understand. Daniel wanted to speak, to say he did not agree, to refuse this twisted form of punishment, but one glance at the captain reminded him what defiance had already cost him. When the ceremony ended, the captain smirked. "You wanted to protect them," he said coldly. "Now you can live with one." The laughter of the other men followed Daniel as he left the chapel. He didn't hold Tazi's hand. He didn't know what to say. They walked together to a small, empty cabin at the edge of the fort, a place once used for storage. That was now their home. Inside, the room was bare, a cot, a water jug, and a small fire pit. Daniel stood awkwardly by the door while she sat on the floor, motionless. The silence between them was heavy but not hateful, It was a silence of two people trapped by forces they could not control. That night, Daniel sat outside under the cold desert stars, staring into the endless sky. He thought about home, about the choices that had brought him here, and about the woman sitting silently behind him. He didn't know her story, only that she had suffered enough. Whatever the world thought, he decided then that he would not add to her pain. In the days that followed, he tried to keep his distance. He spent hours repairing tools at the blacksmith's shop, earning a few coins doing odd jobs. Tazi worked quietly around the cabin, cooking simple meals, sweeping the floor, never asking for help. They barely spoke. She understood little English, and he knew none of her language. But sometimes when he caught her looking out toward the mountains, he saw something in her eyes, something fierce and alive, something that no one had managed to take from her. The soldiers at the fort whispered about them. Some mocked Daniel for living like that. Others said he had gone soft, but Daniel ignored them. He began to realize that his punishment was not what they thought it was. It wasn't shame that weighed on him. It was the realization that the world he had served so faithfully could be cruel and unjust. One evening, he came back from the smithy to find Tazi sitting by the fire, holding a small wooden carving. It was a bird, rough but beautiful, carved from desert mesquite. She handed it to him without a word, and he accepted it quietly. It was the first moment of peace between them. From that night on, something began to change. He started leaving food for her when he went to work, and she began saving some of her portion for him when he returned late. Sometimes he'd find herbs drying by the window, her way of caring when he coughed from the desert dust. They still didn't speak much, but the silence grew softer, like a shared secret rather than a wall. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's anger began to fade. He stopped thinking of his marriage as punishment. He stopped thinking of her as a stranger. She was still quiet, still guarded, but he began to see the strength behind her silence. One day, while mending a saddle outside, he heard her hum softly, a low tune, strange and beautiful, carried on the wind. It was the first time he'd ever heard her voice. That night, Daniel lay awake listening to the desert wind against the cabin walls. For the first time since his arrest, he felt something other than bitterness. He didn't know what the future held for him or for Tazi, but he sensed that their story had only just begun, and that perhaps, even in punishment, fate had given him something precious. The days in the desert seemed to move slower than anywhere else on Earth. The sun rose in a blaze of gold, burned the land until noon, and then faded behind the red mountains like a tired soldier. In that endless heat, Daniel and Tazi lived quietly in their small cabin at the edge of the fort, where the wind carried the smell of dust, smoke, and wild sage. No one came to visit them. To most of the settlers, Daniel was a disgrace, a man punished for refusing an order. To the soldiers, he was a reminder of what happened when you stood against your superiors, and to the settlers' wives, Tazi was invisible, a shadow moving silently between the edges of their world. Each morning, Daniel left early to work at the blacksmith's forge. The clang of metal on metal filled his days, a sound that matched the rhythm of his thoughts, hard, sharp, unending. He didn't complain. It was honest work, and the blacksmith, though rough-spoken, respected his skill. He paid Daniel in coins and food, which was more than most would have offered. Tazi spent her days tending to the small cabin. She fetched water from the well, gathered dry wood, and cooked simple meals over the fire. Sometimes she washed laundry for the soldiers' wives, earning bits of bread or old clothes in return. They never thanked her. They tossed the baskets at her feet and looked away as if her presence shamed them. But Tazi never looked broken. Her face was calm, her back straight, and her eyes deep with quiet strength. Though she said little, her silence had power in it. Daniel began to notice small things, how carefully she folded his shirts, how she kept the cabin clean even when she was exhausted, how she always left a piece of bread on his side of the table. One evening, Daniel returned home later than usual. The forge had been busy, and the sun was already slipping behind the horizon. He opened the door and saw Tazi sitting by the firelight, sewing a torn blanket. The orange glow painted her face, and for the first time he saw how young she truly was. She couldn't have been older than 19. He placed a small bag of flour on the table and said softly, "For bread." She looked up, nodded once, and went back to her stitching. Her English was still weak. and his attempts at her language were clumsy. But slowly, with gestures, signs, and patience, they learned to understand each other. He learned that tu meant water, that Shah meant sun, and that Tazi wasn't just a name, it meant heron, a bird that lives near rivers. That night, as he sat outside, he watched the stars fill the dark sky and thought about what that name meant. A heron, graceful, patient, always standing tall no matter the storm. It suited her perfectly. As the weeks passed, Daniel noticed how the people at the fort treated her. When she walked to the well, they whispered behind her back. Children sometimes threw small pebbles near her feet, pretending it was a game. Once he saw a soldier laugh as she passed, calling her a name she didn't understand. Daniel clenched his fist but said nothing. He knew that speaking up would only make things worse for her. Still, the anger burned in him. He couldn't understand how people could treat another person like that, someone who worked harder than all of them, someone who asked for nothing. One afternoon, when he came back early, he found her sitting outside the cabin with a small clay bowl in her hands. Inside it were green leaves and bits of crushed roots. She dipped her fingers in the mixture and rubbed it on her arms. "What's that?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then pointed to her skin. "Son, hurts." He realized she had made her own medicine for the burns the desert sun had left on her arms. Daniel felt something heavy in his chest, a mix of pity, respect, and admiration. This young woman, sold for $5 and given to him as punishment, had more strength than anyone he'd ever met. That night, he spoke quietly near the fire. "I never wanted this to happen to you," he said. He didn't know if she understood, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. She nodded once and said, "You, not bad man." Those 3 words stayed with him for days. As spring turned to summer, the fort grew busier. More soldiers arrived, and with them came trouble. There were rumors of raids far to the north, and fear spread quickly. The settlers began to talk about the Apaches again, calling them dangerous, untrustworthy, wild. Daniel could see how those words hurt Tazi, even though she never spoke about it. One day, a wagon of traders arrived at the fort, bringing supplies, and with them, a few captured people from distant tribes. Daniel saw the way the settlers looked at them, the same way they had once looked at Tazi. He turned away, his stomach tight. That night, when he came home, he found Tazi sitting outside, staring toward the hills. The wind blew gently, carrying the smell of rain. "Your people?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Far." "Far." Then she looked down. All gone, he didn't know what to say. There were no words that could heal a wound like that. So he sat beside her in silence, watching the stars appear one by one. It was in that quiet moment that Daniel realized something had changed inside him. He no longer saw her as someone he had been forced to live with. He saw her as a person who had lost everything but refused to give up. She had every reason to hate the world, yet she met each day with calm and dignity. As the days passed, Daniel began to defend her in small ways. When the soldiers mocked him, he ignored them. When one of them threw a piece of bread at her feet, Daniel quietly picked it up, handed it back, and told him to leave. The soldiers sneered but didn't challenge him. Word spread through the fort that Daniel Hayes had grown strange. Too soft for a man, too kind for a punishment. But Daniel didn't care. He and Tazi found a rhythm to their days. She began tending a small patch of soil behind the cabin, growing herbs and small vegetables. He built a simple fence and fixed the leaky roof. They didn't need much, just a place where the world could forget them for a while. Sometimes she smiled. It wasn't often, but when it happened, it was quiet and beautiful, like sunlight breaking through a storm. One evening, as thunder rolled across the sky, they sat together watching the rain fall. Tazi reached into her basket and handed him something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small necklace made of tiny desert stones. She had strung them together using pieces of thread. "For you," she said softly. Daniel looked at it, speechless. "Why?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You see me," she said. It was the first time he truly understood how much his kindness meant to her. No one else at the fort had ever looked at her as a person. He didn't see a slave or a punishment. He saw a woman who had endured more than anyone should. That night, as the rain tapped softly on the roof, Daniel sat awake long after she had fallen asleep. He thought about the captain, the fort, the world that had decided to teach him a lesson through cruelty. But he also thought about Tazi's eyes, calm and full of unspoken stories, and how life had a strange way of turning punishment into purpose. In the stillness of the desert night, he realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the quietest people. And though neither of them could say it out loud, something new had begun to grow between them. Something that no command, no punishment, and no cruelty could ever erase. The desert was not a forgiving place. The sun scorched the earth, leaving the land dry and cracked. At night, cold winds howled through the canyons, carrying the sound of distant coyotes and the faint rustle of dry grass. Life on the frontier was a test of endurance, and Daniel and Tazi had quickly learned that survival required more than courage. It demanded patience, resilience, and an understanding of the land that few outsiders possessed. Daniel had always thought he knew hardship. He had grown up on a small farm where the soil was hard and work was unending. But the desert was different. It gave no warnings, made no promises, and punished mistakes without mercy. Even the soldiers who had lived here for years knew to respect it, though not all did. For Daniel and Tazi, the harshness of the frontier became a teacher. Each morning, Daniel rose before the sun, feeding the small goats they had acquired and tending the garden Tazi had begun to cultivate behind the cabin. The plants were sparse at first, tomatoes, beans, and a few herbs, but Tazi tended them with care. She knew which seeds would survive, how to water them without wasting precious drops, and how to protect them from the heat of the sun. Tazi moved with a quiet grace that Daniel often found remarkable. She carried water from the well in a small bucket, her bare feet moving lightly over the dusty ground. She cleaned the cabin, mended clothes, and prepared food for both of them, all while the fort around them continued its noisy, chaotic existence. She never complained, even when her hands were raw and blistered from chores. Daniel watched her closely. He noticed the small details, the way she shaded her eyes from the sun, the careful way she chopped vegetables, and the thoughtful pauses she took as if listening to something only she could hear. He began to understand that her silence was not weakness but strength. It was her way of surviving a world that had given her no choice but to endure. The soldiers at the fort continued to gossip about them, as they always had. Some laughed at Daniel for living with a woman who spoke little English and had no family, calling him soft or foolish. Others whispered about Tazi, mocking her for her background and her quiet ways. But Daniel ignored them. He had learned long ago that the opinions of people who could not see the truth were meaningless. One day, a group of soldiers returned from a scouting mission in the mountains. They carried stories of encounters with Apache warriors, tales of stolen horses, and warnings of more raids to come. Most of the settlers listened with fear, nodding gravely at the stories. Tazi listened too, her face calm, though Daniel noticed the tension in her hands. That evening, as the desert wind cooled the cabin, Daniel asked her, "Does it scare you?" She looked at him for a moment, then shook her head. "Not fear," she said softly. "Care. For life." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel realized that Tazi had survived far more than he could imagine. She had faced raids, capture, and loss, yet she had not let fear control her. Her courage was quiet but undeniable, and it taught him something important. Strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was a steady, unshakable presence. Life on the frontier was also lonely. The nearest town was miles away, and travelers were few. Daniel often worked long hours at the blacksmith, repairing tools for the fort and for the settlers who came occasionally. Tazi stayed behind, tending the cabin and her small garden. They rarely spoke while he worked, yet the silence was not empty. It was a companionable quiet, filled with small gestures of care. A loaf of bread left on the table, water poured into a cup, a blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. One day, Daniel came back from the forge to find Tazi crouched by the garden, examining the leaves of a plant. She held a small bundle of herbs in her hand and pressed them gently, inhaling their scent. He watched her for a moment, marveling at her patience and attention to detail. "You've taught me more than anyone else," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I thought I knew this land, but you see things I could never understand." Tazi looked up at him, her dark eyes calm and steady. "Land, friend?" "Learned together," she replied. Her English was still broken, but the meaning was clear. As summer deepened, the challenges of the frontier became more apparent. Drought threatened the garden and small storms swept through the area, knocking over fences and scattering the goats. Daniel and Tazi worked together to repair the damage, their movements coordinated through gestures and shared understanding. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs before words were spoken. It was during one of these storms that Daniel truly saw Tazi's resilience. A sudden wind had toppled a fence, sending the goats into the nearby hills. Tazi ran after them barefoot, calling softly, her voice carrying over the wind. Daniel followed, struggling to keep up. But when he arrived, he found her calm and collected, guiding the animals back with gentle gestures. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Daniel felt a sense of admiration unlike anything he had known. He realized that the woman he had once seen as a punishment was now his teacher in courage, patience, and survival. She had endured so much, yet she remained unbroken. The fort itself was not always safe. Bandits and raiders roamed the area, and Daniel knew that a careless word or action could bring danger to their cabin. He began to teach Tazi basic safety measures, how to watch for signs of danger, how to move quietly, and how to protect herself if needed. She listened carefully, absorbing every lesson, but she also taught him in return. She showed him which plants could be eaten safely, where to find water hidden in the rocks, and how to read the subtle signs of the land. Their bond deepened not through words, but through shared experience. They began to rely on each other in ways that neither had anticipated. When Daniel was tired from work at the forge, Tazi would bring him water and food without being asked. When Tazi struggled to carry water or gather firewood, Daniel would quietly step in, offering strength without ceremony or pride. One evening, after a long day repairing fences and tending the garden, Daniel sat outside watching Tazi gather herbs. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, and for a moment, the hardships of the frontier seemed to fade. He realized that life here, though difficult, had given him something he had never expected: a companion, a teacher, and perhaps, in time, something more. But life on the frontier was never predictable. One morning, they awoke to find the goats missing. The fence had been broken again, this time more thoroughly. Daniel and Tazi ran to search for the animals, following hoofprints through the dry soil. They worked side by side, calling softly, tracing every path the goats might have taken. Hours later, they returned, exhausted but relieved, with all the animals accounted for. They sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. For the first time, Daniel spoke words he had never said before. "You've changed my life, Tazi," he said quietly. "I came here thinking I was being punished. But now I see that this life, this place, you've made me stronger, wiser." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. "Learn together," she said again. And in that moment, Daniel understood that she meant more than surviving. She meant living, truly living, despite the hardships around them. The desert continued its harsh lessons, but Daniel and Tazi faced them together. They learned to find water in the driest of places, to grow food from almost nothing, and to survive storms that would have broken less resilient souls. Each day, their respect and trust for each other grew, silently but powerfully. Through the harsh frontier, Daniel began to see life differently. He understood now that strength was not measured by force or pride, but by endurance, care, and the ability to rise every day despite suffering. And in Tazi, he saw all of that: grace, patience, and an unyielding spirit that refused to be broken by a world that had given her so little. For the first time, Daniel felt a quiet sense of hope. The frontier was harsh, yes, but it had brought them together. And together, they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The air had changed that summer. The winds were hotter, sharper, carrying dust that stung the eyes and made breathing hard. The fort, once noisy with laughter and work, grew tense and silent. Rumors were spreading. Rumors of outlaws moving across the desert, stealing food, horses, and whatever else they could find. Daniel could feel the unease in every man he passed. Soldiers who once joked around the campfires now kept their rifles close. The settlers locked their doors at night, whispering prayers before sleep. Even the blacksmith, a man who never feared anyone, started closing his shop early. Tazi noticed it too. She spoke little about it, but her eyes followed every sound, every shadow that passed near their cabin. One evening, as the sun set red over the hills, she stood at the door and said softly, "Storm coming." Daniel looked up at the cloudless sky. No rain today, he said with a faint smile. She shook her head. Not sky storm, people storm. He didn't fully understand her words then, but he would soon. For weeks, tension built like thunder on the horizon. The fort's supplies were running low and tempers grew short. One night, when Daniel was returning from the forge, he overheard two soldiers arguing. The bandits were seen near the old mine, one said. They're heading this way. Maybe a dozen of them. Daniel walked faster. His first thought was of Tazi. She was alone at the cabin. He reached home as the last light faded and found her kneeling by the fire, drying herbs. She looked up as he entered and saw the worry in his face. Danger? She asked quietly. He nodded. Maybe, but we'll be careful. She stood, calm as ever, and began gathering things. A jug of water, some bread, a small knife, and a bundle of herbs. Daniel watched her work and realized that she wasn't panicking. She was preparing, steady and focused. It was how she faced every challenge without fear, without wasting time on what couldn't be controlled. That night, neither of them slept much. Daniel sat near the door, his old rifle across his knees, listening to the distant cries of the desert. Once or twice he thought he heard movement near the fence, but when he went outside, the night was empty. Only the wind moved across the dry earth. Morning came heavy and gray. Daniel went to the fort to deliver some repaired tools, leaving Tazi behind with the promise that he'd return by noon. But he never made it that far. Halfway down the dirt path, he saw smoke rising, not from their cabin, but from one of the supply wagons near the fort. Shouts echoed through the air. He ran toward the noise and saw riders, bandits, charging across the open plain. Their faces were hidden behind cloth and their horses kicked up clouds of dust. Daniel turned and sprinted back toward the cabin. His only thought was of Tazi. When he reached the small clearing where they lived, the world seemed to blur around him. The sound of gunfire echoed from the fort. He burst through the door, breathless. Tazi, he shouted. She was already ready, holding a small pouch of herbs and a bucket of water. Her calmness startled him. They come? She asked. He nodded. Yes, we have to stay inside. If they come near, we keep quiet. For what felt like hours, they waited in silence. The sound of shouting grew closer, then faded again. Daniel gripped his rifle tightly, listening to every creak and whisper of the wind. Tazi sat near the window, eyes steady, her hands never shaking. Then suddenly they heard something, a cry from outside. A man's voice. Not a bandit's shout, but something else. It was a soldier calling for help. Daniel's instinct told him to stay put, but Tazi was already on her feet. She moved toward the door. Tazi, no, he said, reaching out. She looked at him, her voice firm but gentle. Hurt, man, we help. He hesitated only a moment, then followed her. Outside, near the fence, they found a young soldier lying on the ground. His leg was bleeding, his face pale. He must have tried to run from the fort and been shot. Daniel dropped beside him, pressing his hand to the wound. Stay still, he said. Tazi knelt next to him, opening her pouch. She crushed herbs between her fingers, mixed them with water, and spread the paste over the wound. Her movements were quick and sure. The soldier groaned, but the bleeding began to slow. Daniel looked at her, amazed. You've done this before? She nodded. My mother, she teach. They carried the soldier inside and laid him near the fire. Tazi continued to treat his wounds, whispering softly to calm him. Daniel watched her and realized that while others saw her as a slave, she was a healer, someone who brought life where others brought harm. Hours passed before the noise outside began to fade. The bandits, finding little to steal, had retreated. The fort was damaged but still standing. When it was finally quiet, Daniel stepped outside. The desert was peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But everything felt different. The next day, soldiers came to check the area. They found the young man alive and told Daniel that his quick action had saved him. But Daniel knew the truth. It was Tazi who had saved him. Word spread quickly. For the first time, people at the fort spoke of her with respect. The wives whispered that the Apache woman had healing hands. Even the captain, the same man who had punished Daniel, sent word that he wanted to see her. Daniel was uneasy about that, but Tazi agreed. She walked with quiet dignity to the captain's office, her chin held high. Daniel stood beside her as the captain. A man who rarely admitted fault looked her over. I hear you saved one of my men, he said. She didn't reply, only nodded once. The captain cleared his throat. "You have my thanks." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "And my respect?" Daniel almost couldn't believe it. The same man who had humiliated him now offered words of gratitude to the woman who had been treated as less than human. As they walked back to their cabin, Daniel glanced at Tazi. "You changed their minds," he said. She smiled faintly. "No, they change when they see." Her words lingered with him. She didn't fight with anger or pride. She changed the world around her with quiet strength and kindness, the same way she had changed him. That night, as they sat together under the stars, Daniel looked at her and felt a deep, unspoken gratitude. What had started as punishment had become a gift. She had taught him that true courage didn't always come from a gun or a uniform. It came from compassion, from standing tall when the world tried to break you. Later that week, the soldier she saved came to the cabin on crutches. He brought a small basket of food and a letter of thanks. "They're saying you're a hero," he told Daniel. Daniel shook his head. "You're thanking the wrong person," he said, gesturing toward Tazi. The young soldier smiled. "Then I thank you both." When he left, Daniel turned to her. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked. She looked puzzled. "Help," she said simply. He nodded. "Yes, but more than that, you helped them see who you are." The days that followed were brighter. People at the fort began greeting them differently. Some even asked Tazi for her remedies. For the first time, they weren't outsiders. They were part of something. As the sun set one evening, Daniel watched her standing by the garden, her hair glowing in the golden light. He realized that redemption doesn't always come with grand speeches or rewards. Sometimes it comes quietly, through kindness, courage, and forgiveness. And though life on the frontier would never be easy, Daniel knew one thing with certainty. The woman once bought for $5 had given priceless lessons to everyone she touched. Time passed, as it always does, but it moved differently for Daniel and Tazi. Seasons changed, bringing scorching summers and cold winters, storms that swept through the desert, and long days of quiet heat. Yet in their little cabin at the edge of the fort, life grew steadily, shaped not by wealth or power, but by courage, patience, and the quiet love that had taken root between them. Daniel and Tazi had learned to rely on one another in ways neither had imagined when their lives first collided. What began as punishment had become partnership, and that partnership had grown into family. Together they repaired the cabin, tended to their small garden, and cared for the goats that wandered the land behind their home. Every day brought work, and every challenge was met with patience and skill. Over the years, the people at the fort began to see them differently. Tazi was no longer the Apache woman or the slave sold for $5. She was the healer, the caretaker, the quiet strength behind Daniel's courage. Settlers came to her when they were sick, when their children had fevers, or when they needed guidance about the harsh land. Soldiers respected her and often asked Daniel for her advice. Even the captain, once so harsh, had grown to admire her calm determination. For Daniel, the changes were deeper and more personal. He had arrived at the fort as a young man seeking purpose, but he left with something far more valuable: a life filled with meaning, responsibility, and love. Tazi had shown him that courage was not only about facing danger, but about kindness, empathy, and standing by someone when the world tried to push them down. One spring morning, as the desert began to bloom with small wildflowers, Tazi sat by the window weaving a basket from reeds. Daniel entered with a small sack of flour and some fresh eggs from the coop. She smiled faintly, her dark eyes reflecting the sunlight. "You see," she said softly, "life grow." Daniel nodded, realizing she was right. Their life, small and humble, was thriving. They had built something together, something that could withstand storms, bandits, and the harshness of the frontier. It was more than survival, it was hope, and it was theirs. The couple began to think about the future. They had saved money over the years, enough to repair the cabin and even expand it slightly. Daniel built a second room where their children could sleep when the time came. Tazi planted more herbs and vegetables, creating a small oasis in the dry desert land. Their children would grow up knowing both worlds, the heritage of their mother and the resilience of their father. Years passed, and soon the first child arrived, a healthy baby girl with dark eyes and soft hair. Daniel held her close, feeling a joy deeper than anything he had known. Tazi watched him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Strong, like dessert," she said quietly. They named her Layla, after Tazi's grandmother, a woman she had never forgotten even in captivity. Layla became the center of their world, her laughter echoing through the small cabin and bringing light even on the hottest, loneliest days. Daniel and Tazi took turns teaching her about the land, the plants, the animals, and the courage it took to survive. A few years later, another child was born, a boy this time. They named him Eli, a name that meant strength in Daniel's family. He grew quickly, curious and energetic, learning to ride goats before he could walk properly. Together, Layla and Eli became a symbol of the life Daniel and Tazi had created, a life that had begun with punishment, but had transformed into love and hope. Despite their growing family, the couple never forgot the lessons of the past. They taught their children to respect the land, to help those in need, and to value courage and kindness above all else. Tazi taught them about her heritage, the stories of her ancestors, and the strength that ran through their blood. Daniel taught them about honor, fairness, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. The fort continued to change over the years. Soldiers came and went. Settlers built homes farther away, and the desert slowly became less lonely. Yet Daniel and Tazi remained at the edge, a quiet example of resilience and partnership. People often came to their cabin seeking advice or aid, and they were never turned away. Their home had become a place of trust, care, and guidance in a land that could often feel harsh and unforgiving. As they grew older, Daniel and Tazi often sat outside together in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains. They reflected on the life they had built, the hardships they had overcome, and the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them together. Daniel thought back to the day he had been punished, forced to marry a woman he barely knew, and marveled at how drastically his life had changed. Tazi rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes following the flight of a heron in the distance. From pain, life, she said softly. Yes, Daniel replied, squeezing her hand. From punishment, purpose. Even the harshest memories of their past, the fear and uncertainty now seemed distant and small compared to the life they had created. They had transformed pain into strength, suffering into love, and cruelty into compassion. Their story was no longer about punishment or hardship. It was about redemption, growth, and the power of human connection. As their children grew older, they began to take on responsibilities of their own. Layla helped Tazi in the garden, learning the names and uses of each herb. Eli learned to care for the goats and carry water from the well. Daniel guided them gently, allowing them to make mistakes but always teaching them the lessons he had learned through his own struggles. Neighbors at the fort began to notice the change as well. They saw a family who lived by example, teaching by actions rather than words. Respect replaced fear. Curiosity replaced ignorance. Slowly, the prejudices that had once surrounded Tazi faded, replaced by admiration and gratitude. People began to understand that the woman once sold for $5 had more courage, skill, and wisdom than many who had grown up privileged in comfort. Even Daniel's former commanding officer, the captain who had punished him so many years ago, visited their home once, quietly acknowledging the strength of the couple and the life they had built. Daniel did not hold any bitterness. He had learned that true courage and redemption often come without recognition, and that a life well lived is its own reward. As the years rolled on, Daniel and Tazi grew old together, watching their children thrive in the land they had tamed. Their life was not free from challenges. There were still storms, illnesses and hardships, but they faced each one together, stronger for the lessons they had learned and the bond they shared. In their final years, Daniel and Tazi often sat side by side, holding hands and watching the desert stretch into the horizon. They had lived a life shaped by both cruelty and kindness, punishment and redemption. They had turned what was meant to humiliate and divide into something beautiful, lasting and sacred. When Daniel passed away, Tazi buried him beneath the hills of the land they had called home, marking his resting place with a simple stone and a few herbs from their garden. She sat there for a long time, feeling the weight of years and the depth of the life they had shared. Though he was gone, his lessons, love, and presence remained alive in her heart and in their children. Tazi continued to live in their cabin, tending the garden and sharing her knowledge with anyone who came seeking help. She taught Layla and Eli everything she had learned, The herbs, the history, the stories of courage and survival. And as they grew, they carried those lessons forward, ensuring that the legacy of Daniel and Tazi would not fade with time. Through it all, one truth remained clear. What had begun as punishment had become a life of purpose, strength, and love. They had shown that even in the harshest conditions, humanity, compassion, and courage could flourish. They had transformed suffering into hope, cruelty into compassion, and despair into a lasting legacy that would continue through generations. When people later told the story of Daniel and Tazi, they spoke not of punishment, not of slavery, and not of hardship. They spoke of courage, love, and the remarkable journey of two people who had changed each other's lives forever. They spoke of a life where kindness triumphed over cruelty, patience over fear, and love over despair. And so the story of Daniel and Tazi became more than just a tale of survival. It became a lesson for all who heard it, that the greatest strength often comes from the quietest hearts, that redemption can come from the most unexpected places, and that a life lived with courage, respect, and love leaves a legacy that not even time can erase.